Hello, everyone, and welcome to CETA, Forgotten Federally Funded Artists, Reshaping the WPA for the 1970s, the second webinar in L&D's Advocating for New Deal Art initiative, and the first of three webinars hosted this month on the interconnections between the New Deal and CETA. My name is Mary Oken, and I am L&D's Assistant Director. If you're new to our organization, we've been around for about 15 years, beginning as a research project in the geography department at UC Berkeley and growing into a nonprofit organization of national scope. Our mission is to document, map, teach, and advocate for New Deal history, primarily through our website, www.livingnewdeal.org, which is an open access archive and educational resource featuring a dynamic and searchable map of over 18,500 New Deal sites. These sites have been collected and mapped with the help of members of the general public who explore their communities, find New Deal sites, and upload them to the L&D website, where staff verify and add them to our national map. Together, we are creating and maintaining the largest inventory of New Deal public works, making an invaluable resource for understanding the New Deal era and its downstream histories available. We do this in the absence of a scholarly journal, an art museum, or an institute devoted to studying and sharing the New Deal's vast impact on American culture. Our website, our fireside newsletter, and other public programs, including tonight's webinar, regularly share and promote new research and perspectives on New Deal history and also its important legacies, among them CETA funding for the arts. The relationship between the New Deal arts programs and CETA funding for the arts first came to my attention shortly after I was hired by L&D in February of 2023. As the newly appointed assistant director, I traveled to the College Art Association annual conference in New York, which is the national meeting of art historians, and heard a panel about how the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, CETA, created a new generation of federally funded artists, once again creating a more diverse, innovative, and community-engaged art world and aesthetic in American culture. Recently finished with graduate coursework, which included many courses on contemporary art of the 1960s and 70s, I was surprised in this panel at how much I did not know. And as I reached out to other New Deal scholars, I realized that I wasn't alone. It has been my pleasure to collaborate with tonight's panelists on a webinar that shares the origin story of CETA's art history, a vital and forgotten legacy of the New Deal arts programs, which I hope you will find as fascinating and enlightening as I do. Like the New Deal, the goal of CETA arts projects was to help communities during hard economic times. And similarly, the communities and artists who participated in CETA-funded arts projects were transformed by them. The year 2024 represents the 90th anniversary of the first New Deal arts projects. And as I hope you'll remember after tonight, 2024 is also the 50th anniversary of CETA funding for the arts, two milestones followed by remarkable art production that offer models for what is possible when the federal government supports the arts. And now, without any further ado, let me introduce tonight's speakers. It is my honor to co-organize and co-host tonight's webinars and the webinars to come on CETA with mixed media sculptor Virginia Maximovich and artist photographer Blaise Tobia. They were both CETA artists, became artist educators at Franklin and Marshall and Drexel universities respectively, and have been volunteering their time as co-coordinators of the CETA Arts Legacy Project, which has a website we will post in the chat, and I encourage you to explore. Through Virginia and Blaise, I have had the pleasure to meet and get to know tonight's other speakers. John Kreidler, who studied New Deal history at UC Berkeley in the late 1960s and returned a few years later to San Francisco by way of civil service in Washington, D.C. to serve in the San Francisco Arts Council, became instrumental in CETA art history. In 1974, he wrote a proposal that sparked the use of CETA funds to hire artists. He went on to become the executive director of the Alameda County Neighborhoods Arts Program, the administrative director of the San Francisco Art Institute, the senior program executive for the San Francisco Foundation, and Executive Director of Cultural Initiative Silicon Valley, all the while researching, lecturing, writing on, and creatively exploring the history of the American arts ecology. He is also a very talented woodworker. Similarly impressive in his credentials, George Koch is a painter, a civil servant, and an arts community organizer in the Washington, D.C. area. In the 1970s, George worked for the Department of Labor under Ernie Green, who you see in our title slide photograph. While a federal employee of the Employment and Training Administration, George was very involved in CETA funding for the arts, guiding the development of Arts DC and the only federal CETA arts study, the CETA Arts and Humanities Employment Analysis and Documentation Project, which established a national inventory of CETA arts and humanities programs and projects, about which you'll be hearing a bit more tonight. George went on to head up many other arts organizations and initiatives and currently serves as the interim president of Artomatic Incorporated. Now, before I turn things over to Virginia and Blaise, I'll direct your attention to the chat where you'll see a link to an L&D webpage with a useful chart for understanding the differences between the New Deal and CETA, as well as a glossary of terms that you may hear during tonight's talks. Now, Blaise and Virginia, over to you.
Okay. Good evening. Excuse us. Okay. I've got to move all these little pictures out of the way.
Okay. Everybody's little icon was on top of our text. That was the issue.
So this is how we first heard of CETA. It was October of 1977, about 2 months after we had just returned to Brooklyn from our 3 years at UC San Diego. Like all young artists, we were trying to figure out how we would make a living. And then Virginia's uncle pointed out, in a very unlikely place, the Daily News, this article, Jobs for Actors, Writers, and Painters. We quickly applied. We were approved as financially qualified, and we were interviewed by professional panels. We both made the cut as 2 of the 300 artists selected from over 4,000 applicants.
On January 3rd, 1978, we showed up for a registration and orientation session at the Fashion Institute of Technology. New York's Cultural Council Foundation was the administrator of the project.
I was chosen to be part of a small unit of photographers and writers who would document the project. This photo is by my documentation unit colleague, George Malave, who's on the far right of the photo. I was given daily assignments that sent me to all parts of the city. Here I'm photographing project artist Bud Wirtschafter in his studio, where he had the first color Xerox machine in Soho. He was a very popular guy.
I was chosen as a community artist. During my 2 years on the project, I held a variety of 3-month, 6-month, and I think even one 12-month assignments. Here I'm working with a group of children in the community center of School District 12 on Tremont Avenue in the Bronx. Here I'm working with an artist named Richard Nixick. We're going over the architectural plans for what had been St. Boniface Catholic School on Willoughby Street in Brooklyn. Along with 8 other CETA artists, we transformed the building into what became known as the Baca Downtown Cultural Center. And here I'm collaborating with a CETA dancer, Marsha Lane, back there in the black leotards, guiding children in how to sketch the human body. And here I'm documenting a collection of antique microscopes at the New York Botanical Gardens. So you could see there were a variety of different types of jobs we were placed in as artists.
Okay, so what was CETA? We've been using that term a lot. CETA stands for the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, the largest federal project of its type since the New Deal. It functioned from 1974 until 1981, employing in total well over 1 million people across the country, among whom were about 20,000 artists and arts professionals, about 2%. The impact that CETA had on the cultural sector, however, was enormous. The amount of money that it pumped into the arts was actually greater than that contributed by the New Deal arts programs, corrected for inflation, and was far greater than the amount contributed by the NEA. Despite their differences, there were many similarities between the WPA and CETA, as reflected in this pair of photos showing murals being created in both projects, 1940 and 1978.
For many reasons, CETA scholarship lags far behind New Deal scholarship. There has yet to be one comprehensive book published about CETA overall, let alone about its arts projects. Here I am in 2023, when we met Mary, at the College Art Association conference in Manhattan, promoting the presentation, Art History in Search of a Historian. So what I was doing was giving CETA 19 tests, and pretty much everyone who stopped to take the test failed. So then we would write them a prescription to come to our panel.
And to be clear, failing meant they had never heard of CETA.
Coming back to our own experience of CETA under the Cultural Council Foundation Artist Project, besides visual artists, our project included classical musicians, jazz musicians, dancers, theater artists, media artists, and literary artists, some of whom would come to your door in a van. It was exceptionally diverse in every sense: race, ethnicity, gender, age, and disability status. And the administrators worked hard to create good matches between us artists and our community sponsors. It wasn't easy.
At that time, we knew something, but not much, about the New Deal art programs. We were inspired to learn more when we discovered that two of our fellow CETA artists had been employed under the WPA, Herman Cherry, who you see here, and Joe Delaney. The 2 years we spent on the project had a lifelong effect on our perceptions of art, of artists, and of the role of art in society. As various milestones of the project came and went, we kept hoping that it would be more widely recognized. Finally, in 2011, a panel discussion among former CETA artists and administrators took place at the new museum, organized by CETA poet Bob Holman, who, by the way, was the inventor of the Poetry Slam, along with a celebration at his Bowery Poetry Club. Some of us who were there decided to work together to make the history of CETA's support of the arts better known. In 2016, a group of us began our research by going to the New York City Municipal Archives, as you see here.
Soon afterwards, we posted a Wikipedia entry and created a website calling ourselves the CETA Arts Legacy Project. There are links to these in the chat. 10 years later, the Legacy Project has accomplished some of its goals. The website has been enlarged and updated, and it links to an online archive with more than 3,000 distinct digital assets. We have organized academic panels, as you've seen, gotten articles published, been interviewed, produced podcasts, and most recently had the great fortune to partner with the Living New Deal. One of our proudest accomplishments was the two-part exhibition in New York City, Artwork, organized in collaboration with City Lore and the Artists Alliance, directed respectively by Molly Garfinkel and Jody Weinberg. The show included about 150 historical photos, along with posters, newspapers, documents, and films. It also included an original copy of the massive how-to binder that had guided the design of CETA artist projects across the country.
One of the people present for the opening of the shows, having flown in from California, was John Kreidler. We had first read about John 40 years earlier in the CCF CETA Journal and considered him a kind of cultural sector hero. We had no idea at the time that we would ever meet him, but it finally happened at the show. Subsequently, we've really enjoyed the chance to collaborate with him.
When we first met John in person, I kidded him that I felt like I was meeting one of the Beatles.
In case you're wondering, in that photo, that's John from 1975 or so, and that's John today.
In connection with our research, we also got to meet another major figure in CETA arts history, George Koch, who both helped CETA arts to expand nationally and to create Washington, D.C.'s CETA project, Arts DC. We now present John Kreidler to you, to be followed by George Koch.
This is a thrill to me to talk about this. It's been virtually lifelong journey of from graduate school to where we are today. But it's startling but true. In U.S. history, there have been two programs that have only two programs that have funded artists in large numbers, and one was the New Deal, and one was of the 1930s, and one was CETA. I'm going to depend on the fact that everybody else has talked about CETA and explained what the acronym stands for. And both were in response to very significant economic crises of the time. The New Deal, most especially its Works Progress Administration, was a federally designed, funded, implemented, and managed program that covered the full extent of the United States, including Indian reservations. It even reached the town where I live right now, Sebastopol, California, which at the time had a population of 2,300 people. It constructed a new post office in 1937, and it was the Treasury Department, which was a major commissioner of art during the New Deal, commissioned a mural by a man named Millett Dean, who earlier on had been part of the Public Place of Arts project in San Francisco, which had done the Coit Tower murals, which became famous and infamous in art history, in American art history. So here is his depiction of Sebastopol, California, where I live in 1937. You'll see chickens, you'll see apple trees, but you won't see any people. But it's a delightful and well-maintained part of our little town. In contrast to the New Deal, CETA's employment of artists was never intended. I mean, it wasn't something that was written into the legislation. It was not something that was required by the Department of Labor or the federal government, but rather it worked through prime sponsors, and prime sponsors were agencies of state and local government, which had basically total control over, almost total control over how these federal funds were used. And that was very much, there were about 400 prime sponsors around the United States. Some were full states, some were full cities. There were various kinds of accretions of local government units that became prime sponsors. But the federal government decentralized control over what occupations they would choose to hire, what services they would provide. And so it was never required even that they be a part of what a prime sponsor would do. So if they chose to hire artists, that was up to them, and how they would then proceed was up to them. They could create works of art, they could create festivals, they could create arts education opportunities. It was entirely up to these prime sponsors. So they were scattered around the United States. They weren't, they didn't cover the full expanse of the United States with arts projects, and those arts projects themselves were pretty unique. Whereas the WPA, it was a centrally cast die, you might say. The New Deal and CETA represented different political philosophies in different eras of the American economy. The New Deal and the WPA in particular were responding to a time of industrial recovery. That was very much on everyone's mind when massive public works projects were kind of the icon of that period. And the New Deal arts programs, which came out of that, were very much associated with those major public works projects, not universally, but that was one of their defining characteristics, was being related to major pieces of infrastructure, dams, roads, public buildings in particular. The slide you see here right now is one of my favorites. This was by an artist named Ralph Stackpole. It's a mural in Coit Tower on top of Telegraph Hill in San Francisco. It's showing a cannery. I used to work in canneries when I was in college. It was a way in Northern California, that was one way you got through college, was by working in canneries. And you'll see off to the right there, women dressed in blue. They're on an assembly line of filling cans or bottles with various kinds of fruit or other vegetables, and et cetera. It goes through those, the bottles get sealed up, they get put onto pallets, and they get trucked away. So this was Stackpole's fresco. The other artist I mentioned before, who did the fresco, the painting in Sebastopol, didn't work on this particular one, but a lot of these artists had worked with Diego Rivera when he was, at various times that he was in residence in San Francisco. This is Stackpole's drawing for that, the women on that assembly line. And this is exactly the kind of factory I worked in the 1960s. Women were on this kind of, they were filling jars, and then men were doing the, moving things around on pallets and the more sort of industrial quality of the work. This sketch, by the way, is something I acquired in 1991. Just a lucky draw. There was a local gallery that did an exhibition of WPA art, and they had some of this available. I should have bought a lot more. Few prime sponsors under CETA used their CETA grants to support infrastructure. So, because it wasn't so the federal government was providing money for concrete and rebar and all of that. It was so that what they were doing was they were, for the most part, the prime sponsors were using their funds to build up or even rescue public services. So police, public health, library services were the kind of the CETA thing to do, as opposed to building dams and roads and buildings. And similarly, the CETA arts projects were mostly service-oriented, as opposed to creating permanent works of art like those Coit Tower murals. So examples being festivals, arts education, performances, exhibitions. That was the mainstay of most of the CETA arts projects. My entry point into this subject came in 1968 when I wrote and Mary referred to this, wrote a master's essay on the WPA arts projects and their implications for contemporary public policy. I was especially struck during that period by learning of 111 WPA community arts centers that had been spread around the country, almost entirely in rural areas, places like Sebastopol, for that matter. Not that we had one of them, but some of those still exist. There's one in New Mexico, for example, that is still in existence. And then coming out of my graduate work, I went to work, as Mary pointed out, first for the Labor Department and then later for 4 years at the United States Office of Management and Budget, where I was a specialist in the domain of federal employment and training policy. And during that time was when CETA was formulated, and it was considered a major new federalism initiative of the Nixon administration. After 5 years in Washington, I enrolled in UCLA's Graduate Arts Management program, which included a sort of self-selected internship, which I chose to spend at the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program, which is the closest embodiment I could find in those days to the community arts centers that had been founded by the WPA. And so in the course of the primary task that I was assigned to by the Art Commission was to come up with a plan for the neighborhood arts culture, the neighborhood cultural centers that were being acquired. They were buying 4 of them in mostly in low-income neighborhoods of San Francisco. This slide shows one of them. It's called the South of Market Cultural Center, and parked in front of it is a neighborhood arts program equipment truck that was used to cart scaffoldings and sound systems and all sorts of things around San Francisco. So I was in job. This was a little bit later. At the point that I was there, these buildings hadn't been acquired. And so I was developing a plan. And in the course of developing the plan, for the operational plan, I was coming into lots of artists who were very much out of work. And as much as anything, felt depressed by the fact that they had few places to show their work. So, you know, here you have a former Fed like me who studied the WPA, and you have all these WPA arts specifically, and all these unemployed artists. So you put A and B together and you say, well, you know, CETA is coming along with the Public Service Jobs Program. Why not see if the San Francisco Art Commission might back a proposal to the CETA prime sponsor in San Francisco, and let's see if we can create some jobs for artists. So I wrote this up. I did it on my own time at home on my old typewriter, and wrote a draft proposal to hire 24 artists in all different occupational categories: media artists, visual artists, performing artists, choreographers, literary artists, and sent it up the chain of command to the director of the San Francisco Art Commission. His name was Martin Snipper. And lo and behold, talk about right place at the right time. Martin was a former easel painter with the WPA in New York City in the 1930s. He had no problem in seeing, oh, so there's a new program that can fund artists, and it's called CETA, fine. So he in turn sent this up the chain of command to the Mayor's Office of Manpower, which was the prime sponsor for San Francisco's CETA program. And it went to Eunice Elton. I actually met with her. Talk about no resistance, quite the contrary. She knew about the history of the WPA arts programs and the other New Deal programs in San Francisco. And she said, this is good, we'll fund it. And but the money had to come through first before they could officially commit to it. And so this is Eunice Elton, by the way, sitting in the living room of Ruth Ozawa's house in the Castro district of San Francisco. And she was a true giant of this program from the outset and through the 6 years that it was in existence, constantly cheerleading for it, giving new funds for it, and real happy with the fact that the Art Commission wasn't a big bureaucracy, that things could be done pretty simply. So in October of 1974, almost exactly 50 years ago right now, it was formally approved, and the positions were scheduled to be hired in December of 1974. The Mayor's Office of Manpower, you had to show up at their office and get an application. 500 people roughly showed up for those applications for 24 positions. And very quickly, those initial 24 positions were hired, December of 1974. A few weeks later, Eunice Elton again comes back to the Art Commission, and she says, can you take an additional 90 positions? 90 positions, 3 times as many, more than 3 times as many as what the Art Commission had initially requested. And she was convinced that there was plenty of need and plenty of qualified people, but in terms of the fact that they were unemployed and the fact that they were workers that could generate public services that could be of use throughout the city of San Francisco. So she was all for it. There was no other proposals that were submitted. That was it. And they were off to the races. And over the next 6 years, Eunice Elton continued to increase. And eventually, there were 400 artists and associated workers in San Francisco. Half of them were based in the Art Commission, and the other half were in nonprofit organizations based in San Francisco. And in fact, some of them were brand new organizations that were started because of CETA. Now, through those 400 positions, according to one person I interviewed on this subject, about 800 people flowed through them And the reason for this is because CETA positions are limited to 18 months duration. So there was constant turnover that was sort of built into this. And so you had 800 slots, but there were more than 400 slots, but more than 800 people who occupied those slots over the course of 6 years. And the city committed, as best as I can ascertain, 11% of all of its CETA public service jobs funding was committed to artists, which is quite remarkable high figure. News of this spread throughout the country very quickly. The New York Times did a feature article on it, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic did a wonderful article about it. It was called Bringing Back the WPA. So it was understood right away around the country without anybody preaching about it, that this was connected to, this was kind of a continuation of what the WPA had done. And recognition came almost immediately from the National Endowment for the Arts. They saw that this had significant potential. I don't know, George might have a different view about this. They may have seen this taking off before the Labor Department did, but they commissioned a film that was shot by a local production group in San Francisco called Optic Nerve. In February of 1975, I think was when they commissioned it. It was hardly underway. And by the time it was more fully underway, by the time they finished it in late 1975, and it became a leading device that the National Endowment used for stimulating CETA arts projects in other parts of the country. Another force, by the way, that was coming online at this point were state and local arts councils were being established all over the United States, and they got behind this very early on. And indeed, a good number of them were staffed from the outset by CETA artists themselves. In any event, projects were rapidly originated in and organized in Seattle, state of North Carolina, Baltimore, Los Angeles, San Diego, Chicago, Portland, Oregon, and among many others during this early period of CETA arts. Now I have to back up a little bit here because I wasn't involved in any of this except the early proposal phase that I was certainly involved in. But as of September 1974, this was before the first 24 positions were filled, I was hired to run the neighborhood arts program, and Mary mentioned this, in Alameda County. So I was now out of San Francisco, and I was trying to encourage Alameda County's 3 prime sponsors, and they eventually did fall into line and supported CETA arts projects. This project owes its grandeur, its performance over a period of 6 years to 5 people that I'm going to label the heavyweights of CETA arts history in San Francisco. Eunice Elton obviously was one of those people. The person pictured here, Stephen Goldstein, who was the head of the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program, was a walking encyclopedia of the arts in San Francisco. He knew the artists, he knew the arts organizations, he knew the history. He had voluntarily worked for Imogen Cunningham as her darkroom assistant in the early days of photography in his lifetime. So Stephen was the mastermind behind a lot of the ways in which artists were used in San Francisco. Following the next person, and this is an Imogen Cunningham picture of her friend, her very good friend, Ruth Azawa, internationally known artist, but also well known as a longtime advocate of arts education in the public schools. She was the founder and director of a arts project where her children were students. It was called the Alvarado School Arts Workshop. And she immediately encouraged she was a member of the San Francisco Art Commission, by the way. And she held up her hand and said, why don't I take 40 of those positions, 40 of the original 114. And in short order, they were in all 53 of the San Francisco public elementary schools. And it just took off from there. So she was one of the very early and very significant people involved in determining the the direction of this. And another person, Elsa Cameron, she was the very young at the time director of the School of Arts at the Young Museum, which had something called the trip out trucks. Excuse me, it took me a little while. Trip out trucks that went around to San Francisco's public schools. There's some wonderful footage in the Artworks videotape that I mentioned earlier of an artist named Michael Cookingham and who was on those pickup trucks. But they were also active throughout the public schools of San Francisco. And finally, Anne Marie Thielen. By the way, George, this is a screenshot from your film. And Anne Marie was the general manager of the 200 CETA arts positions that were under the control of the Art Commission, as distinct from the other 200 positions that were farmed out to local nonprofit organizations. And she was also a close associate of Ruth Asawa and very effective as the manager of this. So I was over in Oakland, but these were the people who were actually devising and running this program over a period of 6 years. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about the outcomes of this. I've written up a brief synopsis of those, and they're available, I believe, through the website of the Living New Deal. But I'll just mention those, what I think are the most significant outcomes, and all of which are still observable in San Francisco. Most immediately, there were broad services that were provided all over San Francisco. This is the slide is the Pickle Family Circus, 3 great clowns who are all CETA employees. That's Bill Irwin on the left, Jeff Hoyle in the middle, and Larry Pizzoni on the right. They're all still with us and have had long careers. Pickle Family Circus was in business probably for about 12 to 15 years after CETA, maybe a bit more than that. But its legacy continues on, and it was organized de novo with CETA funds under the leadership of mostly of Larry Pizzoni on the right. So, but there were quantum increases in neighborhood level parades, festivals, classes, workshops that have been perpetuated subsequently through the 4 new neighborhood art centers that the Art Commission acquired shortly after CETA was winding down. They came online. So that's a major accomplishment. I mean, San Francisco's become, in my estimation, sort of an outdoor stew pot of all kinds of cultural activities along the lines of New Orleans, which I think is maybe the premier place for that in the United States. Secondly, there was, we're a little ahead of ourselves with that slide, that's okay. But the city's capacity in arts education, I've already said, was hugely built up under CETA. And that was especially important because in 1978, California passed its infamous Proposition 13, which killed a lot of arts education, but it kept going in San Francisco in part under CETA and under continuing work of Ruth's organization. And later on, there was an entire high school. It's called the Ruth Asawa High School of the Arts. Currently has an enrollment of 800 in San Francisco. There's no question that she had a grand influence on the continuation of arts education in San Francisco. A third outcome is depicted in this photograph here. The outdoor mural movement. I mean, murals had a long history in San Francisco, certainly WPA and before WPA, Diego Rivera, and before Diego Rivera, there were others. But 4 women pictured here, known as Las Muralistas, they are Graciela Carrillo, Consuelo Mendez, Irene Perez, and Patty Rodriguez. There are now 2 generations of women artists in the Mission District of San Francisco that have continued this work. And that's not, and there are murals all over San Francisco that were not done by them, but they had an enormous influence in the Mission District, which for what it's worth, became in part a major tourist destination because of all. I mean, there were entire streets that were transformed by these and other artists. So, the final thing, a little more elusive to sort of pick out a slide for it, but before CETA came along, there were roughly 40 nonprofit cultural organizations in San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area. At the end of CETA, there were 700 of them. And many of them, some of them got their start with, as did the Pickle Family Circus, and another organization that I think so highly of, the Oberlin Dance Collective under Brenda Way, got some of its initial support from CETA. But a lot of them, if they weren't de novo started by CETA, were certainly propelled forward, as did some of the major arts organizations. The San Francisco Ballet had CETA positions. I don't think any of the dancers, but backstage people were. So those are all very significant and visible to this day. In the course of my work at the Alameda County Neighborhood Arts Program, here I am in my days of Johnny Appleseed of CETA. My wife refers to me as Captain Sideburns in this period of time. And so I was set out to travel around to conferences and prime sponsor conferences in various parts of the country, and to show the artworks tape of San Francisco, and to lecture about how this could be done. I also did a fair amount of on-site technical assistance on behalf of the California Arts Council, which was so supportive during these periods. It's ultimately under Jerry Brown, under the governor at the time. One of its chairman of the board was Peter Coyote, who was himself a very active artist in San Francisco CETA Arts Program. So from an art history perspective, you might think of these early years of CETA as kind of an improvisational period. And we had this federal funding, but a remarkably supportive city administration, no interference, nothing but help from the federal government. I mean, the National Endowment for the Arts had been helpful. And new federalism kind of worked in this circumstance. Minimum bureaucracy, a lot of artwork got done, a lot of people got hired, and it happened pretty easily. When you look back on that era and you look around the country at where it went, it was somewhat haphazard in how, where, and when it took place. But that said, it was still highly fertile. But in 1977, I left the position at the Neighborhood Arts Program to work at the San Francisco Art Institute. And my office was located 50 feet from this mural. And I'll point out that the large guy in the upper center with his butt facing us is Diego Rivera himself. Immediately to his left, there's an artist with a checkered shirt and a cap and glasses. And in his hand, there's a pneumatic drill, and he's working on a piece of sculpture. That is Ralph Stackpole, who did that fresco that I showed you in Coit Tower. So Rivera was very influential in all of this. Anyway, I can't help myself when it comes to art history. I have to digress a little bit there. But Steve Goldstein was the president of the Art Institute at this point, a place where he had been as an undergraduate himself. And so my job was now being the operations director of the Art Institute. And so I no longer had this platform for CETA, but as that, it just so happened that that was pretty much the moment when Jimmy Carter, happy birthday, Jimmy, was sworn into office, and thus began a more serious and protracted and larger series of CETA arts projects. And you could say this was CETA's renaissance, was taking place, I think, mostly under the Carter administration. And now it came to New York for the first time in a big way with the project that Blaze and Virginia were employed by. And there was field research, there were case histories, there was documentation, there was advocacy carried out. And all of that was led by our next speaker, George Koch. And in his spare time, he was organizing a major CETA public service jobs project for artists in Washington, D.C. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to George.
Thank you, John. I'm going to kind of walk you through my CETA journey. And let me give you a brief introduction. In 1975, while working in the Office of Policy, Evaluation and Research, OPER, in the Employment and Training Administration, ETA, an agency of the U.S. Department of Labor, a colleague shared with me a newspaper article titled "A CETA Production, The Public Artist Returns." That article introduced me to John Kreidler, who wrote the proposal for San Francisco Public Art Program, and I immediately started to work on a proposal for DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. Here's a note. In the early 1970s, I started to work at ETA. I came to ETA from the Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, in 1965 as a result of that agency being dismantled. Another fact to keep in mind, in the late 60s, I was appointed by the new mayor of the District of Columbia to be a commissioner on the state arts agency based on my leadership of the Arts and Culture Committee and the Metropolitan Washington Council of the AFL-CIO. More on the CETA proposal later. CETA partnership in the arts. In 1978, Ernest Green and the Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training and the Secretary of Labor, Ray Marshall, wanted to do more to encourage the use of the arts and humanities in CETA. They wanted to reprint 6 national articles from the department's Work Life magazine into a new publication, The Partnership of CETA and the Arts. On behalf of ETA, I was asked to investigate if the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities would want to develop an interagency agreement with ETA. ETA needed a quick response, and Lee Kimchi, the director of the Institute of Museum Services, was an eager participant. She penned a Dear Museum Director letter with Assistant Secretary Green that opened the publication, The Partnership of CETA and the Arts. Here are a few quotes from the interagency agreement document. We can make public support of museums and the arts even more important in our national life than it was during the Depression. The second, our public support now has one very important advantage over the public support then. It's based on local decision-making under CETA. A foreword by Assistant Secretary Green for the same document is as follows. And one, his 2 comments. CETA's role in public support of the arts and humanities has been a vital one. The nation is coming to realize that arts and humanities are much more than a leisure time activity. They are a source of creativity, which can enrich our lives. The Office of Policy Evaluation and Research, OPER, that I mentioned before, I submitted a research proposal that would allow ETA to better understand and document CETA and the arts and humanities activities. The proposal was approved and a report was issued in 1981 by the contractor. The focus of the study was to prepare an analysis and documentation of the arts and humanities under Title VI of the CETA legislation. The study looked at over 400 prime sponsors across the nation, resulting in what they called the CETA Ahead Project. This report includes 3 parts: a monograph, 15 case studies, and a film entitled A Place in the Workforce. The CETA monograph, the most apparent finding was the interesting breadth of the CETA arts and humanities partnerships. The data showed that prime sponsors cultural subcontractors had created several thousand projects between 1974 and 1981, which was then the time frame for the study. An advisory panel to study the ETA were representatives from ETA, from the department's Office of the Secretary for Policy, Phil Cadis from the National Endowment of the Arts, James Early from the National Endowment of the Humanities, Ann Hartzell, the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities, and Marcy Pearson and Dennis Foray from the Institute of Museum Services. The CETA film, A Place in the Workforce. The film includes selected arts and humanities that are included in some of the case studies. It was titled A Place in the Workforce. The 15 case studies offer some subtle and complex lessons, including these. There has been an increasing acceptance of the culture industry. 2, strong programmatic partnerships have emerged. 3, the CETA cultural projects have met the needs of a broad range of workers. 4, the culture industry skills have proven easily transferable to other occupations. From the study, it suggested that potential program operators should prove helpful in the future employment and training activities utilizing cultural and related occupations. The case studies are available independently and are listed above. Case study number 5, and I promised to bring you back to the one in DC. ArchDC CETA arts programs, which operated in the District of Columbia from 1977 to 1982, employed many of the city's artists during a period of substantial artistic activity. Using federal CETA funds, ArchDC paid over 300 theater artists, designers and painters, musicians, sculptors and dancers, writers, poets, and other artists and technicians and artist administrators to work in over 100 arts organizations. ArchDC program was co-sponsored by the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities and the United Labor Agency, the nonprofit arm of the labor movement. For 5 years, ArchDC injected more money into the DC arts community than all other DC Arts Commission activities combined. In 1977 to 78, the entire DC grants budget was about $200,000, while the ArchDC budget for artists and arts workers' salaries was about $500,000. In FY 78-79, ArchDC paid nearly $1 million in salaries to DC artists and arts workers, the equivalent of about $300,000 in 1916 dollars. Unique programming. The innovation structure and strategies that distinguish the ArchDC program include: 1, intentionally designing ArchDC as an employment program for artists and arts workers, not as an arts support program. 2, establishing post-program participant employment as the overriding objective. And 3, integrating artists and arts worker participants into actual arts labor market of existing organizations and employers instead of creating separate CETA arts projects. Placing small numbers of artists and arts workers into existing arts organizations thought to have the resources to hire them or secure other post-program employment, and providing powerful incentives for the organizations to do so. Having the arts organization worksites select the artist and the arts worker participants placed with them. Limiting the subsidized placement of artists and arts workers with any organization to 1 year, terminating their participation in the Arts DC program at the end of each CETA grant year. 7, adopting approaches shown to be effective in employment and training programs such as job clubs. As a result, this strategy over the time of Arts DC produced an 86% placement rate. Thank you. Now turn it back over to our colleagues.
Thank you all so much. We're a little bit short on time. We have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have a question in the chat, I'll just say very quickly that I forgot to say in the introduction, which is thank you so much to our donors who support our public programming and these kinds of partnerships. Myself, I was struck by first of all, your committed service, not only during the CETA period, but long after, and seeing all the images, which I haven't seen, just how much and how many communities were going in and out of this incredible system that CETA created, and how, despite the differences between the New Deal and its management of art programs and CETA, there were a lot of similar outcomes in terms of impact. And I'll just for those of you who are here, we'll have 2 more webinars, one next Thursday and one the following Thursday, that will give you more understanding of what the impact on artists were and what the impact on communities were. The first next Thursday featuring Judy Baca, a major LA muralist and artist educator and activist, as well as Colleen Hooper, a historian of CETA dance. And then the following week, Ted Berger on the 17th, who's a major arts administrator and involved in CETA administration in New York City, as well as Lou Bellamy, who is a major theater director and the founder, with the help of CETA funding, of Penumbra Theater in Minnesota, which is a major Black theater company that's done incredible work since the 1970s. So I'll open it up to Q&A. There's a question from David Taylor, who asks, I believe in Minnesota, August Wilson was involved in CETA work. Is that right?
Yes, that's
Yes.
correct.
He was at Penumbra.
Yeah, so he's one of, and you may hear about him if you come to our webinar on October 17th.
Mm-hmm. You
And
definitely will.
And there's a US postage stamp with his image on it.
He was in New Orleans, and the theater program in Minneapolis, St. Paul, invited him to come up, and they immediately got him listed as a CETA employee.
We have another question about current policy, and I don't know if our speakers will have things to say about this. Do you know if there are any hidden artist employment / training opportunities in the Inflation Reduction Act? I've heard kind of murmuring about artists and arts organizations seeking something along the lines of CETA in figuring out how to use the funding from other federal legislation to do this. But do you all know anything about this?
John?
The closest I can think of, and I'm not an authority on this, is this Climate Corps, which is loosely based on the Civilian Conservation Corps of the New Deal. And they've enrolled something like 15,000. This is a federal program. It's an initiative of the Biden administration. 15,000 young people are currently part of it. And recently they have been hiring storytellers and artists who are now trying to develop narratives around what has been coming out of this. All I know is that that's going on right now, and it should be searchable pretty easily.
I'd like to add something that I think that CETA and the WPA taught us, and I'd say especially CETA, since the arts program weren't envisioned as parts of it, is that I think we as an arts community have to look for ways in other kind of legislation and programs that artists can be of use. So like the project you're talking about, John, that's sort of slipping in,
Right.
to this other project. And honestly, I think we wasted a lot of time during the pandemic not lobbying properly to get into some of these programs.
I recall a lecture that I attended probably in about, I don't know, 1978 or 79 in San Francisco, that was given by the head of the New York State Arts Council, Ted Striggles. I don't know if anybody remembers Ted Striggles. He's a wonderful director for New York State Arts Council. And he said, what do you suppose is the #1 supporter of the arts in the United States today? And this was a San Francisco crowd. And, what did New York, the National Endowment for the Arts wasn't particularly large. And he said, oh, there's no question. The #1 supporter of the arts today in the United States is the New York State Unemployment Insurance Program. And he said, every nonprofit arts organization in New York knows how to use it to their advantage. That they're typically seasonal. They have to lay off their actors or dancers or whatever, and then they get them going again under the unemployment insurance system, and it allows them to do rehearsals in other parts of the whatever. But but still, the point is a very good point. That there may be some other avenues out there that I'm not aware of, certainly.
I think we need to identify some champions in the various federal agencies and in Congress to begin to look at what those possibilities can be. I mean, I feel sort of out of it, not being in the bowels of the bureaucracy anymore, of knowing what some of those opportunities might be. But those opportunities, I'm sure they're there. You know, as old heads in this environment, we can talk about what we did and what we were involved in. I think one of the unique things between the Arts DC project and John and Blaise is that we really focused on people getting jobs after CETA. And that's why we worked with existing organizations so that they got some experience with artists. And in fact, if they didn't, people get jobs because of people they know. Putting people in those employment situations is one quick way for them to find a job at the end.
Mary, I think I can also sort of interject a bit here, showing how much times have changed, in a less progressive way, shall we say. The thing that comes closest to CETA at this moment, and it just kind of ended, was an 18-month project funded privately by the Mellon Foundation called Creatives Rebuild New York, which employed 2/5 of its program was pretty much just based on the same CCF CETA model that we worked for. So it kind of got revived in a small way for 18 months, but with private money.
I'll just share from my own research of in art education following the New Deal era, the case that was made for funding art education, which was sort of the successor in terms of public funding for the arts after the war. The argument that was made was that the arts and public arts, especially arts education, were cultivating good citizens, people who fight against fascism on a fundamental intrinsic level because they were cultivating a sensitivity to others' expressions, to others' identities, and so on. And I think, thing I didn't say in my introduction is American art and American art history we live under capitalism, and it tends to be a market-driven industry and a market-driven history. And I think what CETA shows us and the New Deal shows us are these moments where the federal government intervenes and creates not just opportunity for work, but access to opportunity for so many different kinds of people that enriches American life in ways that we even can't see. And as you'll see from the next two webinars, Judy Baca will talk to you about, for example, her career as a muralist and educator and the impact that has had on so many different things that you can and can't see in the built environment. And similarly, Lou Bellamy and others, there's so many organizations that came out of the New Deal and institutions, and just as many under CETA. So it's incredible. And the COVID-19 relief was definitely a moment that I wish we had more of a say, because we were certainly paying attention to the arts more.
Well, I think the third webinar will touch on some of this, because Ted Berger consulted with Creatives Rebuild New York. So did the CETA Legacy Project. So he's got, some ideas.
We'll hear more about that and I hope you'll join us. We have one other question about the Alvarado School Arts Workshop. John, we have an audience member who's actually part of the Living New Deal team who's asking, do you know if the Alvarado project is still in existence? I believe that it has a successor that's still around, but do you know?
Yeah. There are different versions of this, but there is a program which exists today, which is called the San Francisco Arts Education Project, I think. It was at one point called the San Francisco Arts Education Foundation, and it traces its roots back to Ruth Ozawa's Alvarado Arts Workshop. And it's very much active. It's headed by, tragically, Steve Goldstein passed away a few months ago. His wife, Emily Keeler, is the head of that program. So it's still in existence. It's still supplementing what goes on in the public schools. But the big news in California is there's now a piece of a statewide initiative that was passed a few years ago that's now requiring all schools to spend something like 1% of instructional funds now must be spent on the arts. And it's the problem we have right now in California is we don't have enough teachers of arts. Believe it or not.
Something we can all use. I'm conscious of the time, so I think Blaise and Virginia, I don't know if you want to say a couple of words in closing. I just will reiterate, please go to Eventbrite and register for our two more webinars on this really exciting and interesting topic. Please explore the Living New Deal webpage that we linked, which we'll be adding to, and has really good and the terminology for some of the things that you heard today and more. Blaise and Virginia, do you want to?
The only thing in closing I would say to everybody who tuned in, besides thank you, it's a big topic and we can't do it justice in an hour. Okay, even though the history is amazing. So this one was an introduction. There's going to be two more, but please go to the website, go to the Living New Deal website too, and read. Go to the digital archive. It's an open access archive.
And if you happen to be an art historian looking for something to write about, get in touch with us.
Well said.
And with that, we thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you the following 2 Thursdays. And we're grateful to have you with us. And I'm very grateful for our panelists. Thank you, John. Thank you, George. Thank you, Virginia. My honor. Take care.